So happy to be here, and thank you so much. And thank you everybody who's uh, joining in from wherever. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're from. And I'm going to be talking today about open context and publishing archaeological data on the web. And since we're talking about context a lot, I'll just give you a little bit of context about where I am in Berkeley, California, which is territory of the Huichin. This is the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And it's of great importance also to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and the descendants of the Verona Band. And that kind of acknowledgement about where I'm speaking to you from and the kinds of relationships, the deep history of where I'm from, the land that I'm speaking from, is the kind of thing that I hope helps frame a lot of our discussion today, because these kinds of issues are absolutely integral to how we manage data properly and ethically. So as I introduced, we're going to be looking at Open Context today. And Open Context is a publisher of research data on the World Wide Web. And our main attributes are that we're of open project, meaning that we're open source, we're open access, so there are no access restrictions to open context. The data are open. That is not just in terms of being able to click around the website, but also because the data have copyright licenses and methods to promote technical interoperability so that the data can leave open context and be reused in other systems. And the entire infrastructure is supported by a stack of open source technologies, which are maintained by communities worldwide and lots of different institutions. So it's really based on the fact that there's a huge amount of collaboration and collaborative infrastructure development that is taking place that we're able to build upon. That also goes with not just the sort of like software that we use, but also the supporting infrastructure in terms of preservation. So we work with the California Digital Library, which is part of the University of California system. And they're the main institutional repository for preserving the data that we publish. But we also work with other institutions for issues of data preservation and access, one of which is the German Archaeological Institute, the DAI. And that organization is actually part of the German Foreign Ministry. And they maintain a mirror site of open context. And we use some other infrastructure too. So the Internet Archive, we put a lot of media resources, and also Zenodo, which is European Union financed data repository. We've added some media resources and data sets to that as well. So we try to make sure that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and that we're using this infrastructure that supports science and research, communication, and collaboration that is managed by a lot of different non-commercial actors around the world. And the work that we've been doing with Open Context has, let's see, we started, we launched the website in 2006. So it's been around for quite a long time now as far as these digital humanities and science support systems go. And over time, it's grown in recognition and in use. And we won a Digital Curation Award in 2014. The AIA gave us an award for our contributions in digital archaeology in 2016, and the Obama White House in 2013 for promoting open science. So it's had some recognition, and that is great and all, but it's also really fundamentally because there are all of these other systems and supports and data sets and infrastructure that we're able to use and build upon. And as we do that, as I'll be talking about today, we help promote and enhance their own systems too. So it's a reciprocal thing when you use the resources that other people are helping to develop. And I mentioned that we started out in 2006. It's really still a work in progress, so we're never really done. And I'm right now in the middle of a major software revision and re-architecting of open context, and that's the longer that we are around, the more data that we have, the better that we understand our needs. These kinds of needs of rebuilding and re-architecting and really refurbishing everything we're just recognizing that this is continual, and that's part of the reason for that. The need that we have to keep on working on this and improving is because the landscape and the expectations and our notions of good practice are also constantly evolving. So there are two main guiding principles that I'll be talking about today that are sort of frame how we think about how to conduct our work, how to what sorts of technology investments and what sorts of organizational practices that we need to adopt. And those are the FAIR data principles and the CARE principles. And so FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's really what's behind the whole notion about open data, that there are certain attributes about data in the infrastructure that support the dissemination of data that need to be considered in order to make data truly open and truly reusable by wider communities. And at the same time, we also have to consider CARE principles, and that is because archaeology, like many other disciplines, takes place in a really complex social context. And that social context involves histories of colonialism, involves histories of really radical power asymmetries, and one can't ignore those issues. The context that creates in the creation and the dissemination and the reuse of data is actually really, really important. And it's a challenge, and it's both presents challenges and opportunities in the sense that we have to really think about the ethical framing of our practices. And opportunities in the space are also like we could really widen and diversify participation and engagement with data, research data. In our context, that would be archaeological data. So these are the two main guiding principles that we consider when we're trying to work on further development of open context. So I just mentioned that there's some of these sort of getting a little bit deeper when you try to put CARE and FAIR data principles into practice. There are this sort of background and ethical issues, and there's sometimes not a lot of guidance in this. We're engaged in kind of a new frontier when it comes to managing structured data and media, sometimes at really big scales. How do we actually do that? How do we go about doing that ethically? How do you have meaningful consultation and engagement and stakeholder governance when there's no real model for doing that, maybe at a continental or a global scale, because we're working at very different levels of scale when we deal with archaeological data. So it could be at a very micro level when you're looking at the data sets associated with a particular site, and maybe there's a particular local community that sees that as very important. But we also have to sort of consider how that actually works at a global scale, because that data, once it goes onto the World Wide Web, will be accessible around the world to lots of people, and it could be integrated and aggregated in lots of other systems and put together with data sets from many other places. And those data sets too will have lots of sensitivities associated with them. So you can see that there's a huge amount of challenge and complexity when you start thinking about some of these ethical concerns when you're moving up and down these levels of scale from very local up to global. Archaeology is also really interesting in the fact that it's a discipline that really relies on the inputs of many, many other disciplines. So we straddled the natural sciences as well as the humanities and the social sciences. And there are lots of different disciplinary inputs in the data sets that we have to curate and aggregate and try to understand. And that some of those disciplines have well-established and well thought out standards about how to create and organize data. And other parts of our world, there's very little consensus. And so this creates a lot of semantic challenges about how do we meaningfully bring together these data and relate these data together. And that, again, is also just further magnified when you start thinking about doing that at scale. So that is a big concern, and that's a big challenge. And to support all of that, there's obviously has to be a technical infrastructure, and that's one of my main concerns. I'm the technical director of Open Context, and when you start thinking about data at such varied scales and of such variety of different kinds of media, but also describing such very different things from regions down to maybe a microscale thing like a sample of a potsherd that's used for like petrography or neutron activation analysis, that these are could involve lots of different kinds of technical requirements to be able to support sharing data and organizing data for all of these various kinds of phenomenon that archaeologists observe. And we all have to do all of this, meet all of these challenges on a shoestring, right? So there's very little in the way of resources. These are very scarce, both in terms of financing, running our technology stack, having the software engineering available to us to be able to meet these needs, and also just the time and attention that it requires to actually think through these kinds of issues and put the thought and the dedication that's needed into it, the intellectual investment into this, really to navigate the sort of theoretical, the ethical challenges also. So it's not just about having the software engineers, but we also have to have the community that has the time and the capacity to really think through how to do this and how to do this well. And building that kind of capacity in our community is also one of the biggest challenges associated with working with data in archaeology. So I mentioned that Open Context is a publisher of archaeological data, and this just to try to give a sense about how we fit into a broader landscape. And we're saying that we're a publisher. We're sort of focused on one aspect of the larger kinds of sets of concerns around, say, research data management. And one of the main concerns that's been articulated in our community a lot, and it's this absolutely essential, important concern, is the notion of archiving and data preservation, right? So that we run around, we do all these research projects, we do surveys, we do excavations, we do all sorts of laboratory and collection studies. And the data that we create, we need infrastructure and services to help preserve those data so that they could actually be reused by wider and future communities. And that's absolutely important and essential. And I don't want to, I want to make sure that I make that very clear. However, we're also thinking about this in terms of what is it that's also required to make those data intelligible and meaningful for broader communities. So in that sense, just preserving bits is necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? So we also have to invest that kind of effort and investment into thinking about how do we communicate the meaning and the value and the purpose of these data so that wider communities can actually understand and reuse them appropriately. And to help frame that notion of investing and the sort of value added aspects of it, the curatorial, editorial, and intellectual investment in data, that's why we think we're calling ourselves a publisher of data, because that's the kind of thing that we're trying to promote. It's not just sort of put a spreadsheet into a repository and walk away, but actually think about what you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to reach, and the other kinds of data that could articulate with the data that you're sharing. Those are really central kinds of questions. And as far as data sets that we've published, and they range all over the place in terms of their purposes and the content that's in them, and the regions and time periods around the world that they represent. So some data sets are really meant to be the sort of exhibition and showcasing of ongoing research projects. So the Poggio Civitate project, which is an Etruscan site in Italy, is one of those where it's an ongoing project. It's been going for more than 50 years now, just continuous excavation, except for the pandemic, for about 50 years. And really, they're showcasing their data and trying to make it available for the collaborative research team and the students that are working on that project. Another important project is the Digital Index of North American Archaeology. David Anderson and Josh Wells are co-PIs of that, and that is really sort of an informatics research project, and it's also morphing into a metadata and digital library and museum kind of a project too, where we're aggregating archaeological site file records from states across the United States, publishing them on the web and making those available as a way of linking and indexing resources that are in museums and libraries and repositories that document North American archaeology. And then there are several other kinds of projects too. So one of the other things that we've also done are support reproducible research. So if a researcher is publishing an article and they have supporting data that are described in that article, we've provided a framework for publishing those data that cross-reference with the manuscript in peer review literature, and that goes with both journal articles and also increasingly monographs too. So large book publications about archaeological projects. Now, publishing data, I haven't really talked about this too much, about actually what happens when people give us data sets and how we work with it. And it is sort of described in this overall, this slide provides an overview of it. So there are lots of different software that people use when they are actually creating their own data. And sometimes their database is really not really a database, but it's just an Excel spreadsheet, and where they have rows and columns of records. And in other cases, they'll be using FileMaker or Access or some other database system. And in the case of a lot of archaeological excavations, many research projects actually have lots of specialists who are managing their own data sets individually, in addition to maybe a larger project data set. So say the zooarchaeologist may have a spreadsheet, somebody else who's looking at maybe, say, spindle whorls has their own database, and then the excavation might have a relational database that documents features and deposits and whatnot. So all of those are different data sources for us, and we ask researchers to provide us extracts of those data sets in the form of tabular data dumps. We use a software called OpenRefine to be able to clean that up. In the case of the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, we also use that to help identify and redact sensitive data. And what's cool about Refine is too, it has like this infinite undo kind of a feature, so that you can actually track every single change that you make on a database, on a data set, and document it, and have a sort of a version history in some ways to be able to see what you've actually done. So it provides a bit of traceability in these changes, and that's important, because you sometimes need to go back, how did this record turn up like that? Anyway, so cleaning data, improving consistency, redacting sensitive information, these are the kinds of steps that we do when we publish data. So it is time consuming and labor intensive, But again, this is one of the things we're arguing, is that somebody has to do that, invest that kind of labor. So in addition to doing those, extracting data from source data sets, cleaning them up, and then moving them into open context, we also relate data that we publish with data that other people publish in organizations that are outside of ours. And sometimes those are databases. Say gazetteers like GeoNames or Pleiades. Sometimes they're metadata sources. So the Library of Congress has subject headings that we reference. The Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus is another one of these authorities that has concepts that we reference. And then sometimes they're repositories of other kinds of content. So TDAR, JSTOR, the Federal Register, these are all other resources on the web that help build context and meaning for the data that we publish. And those are important things that we reference and link, so that are described and annotated with the vocabularies and with the content that are curated by expert communities around the web. And just to explain why we do all of that, it seems like a lot of work, and it really is. It's because somebody has to do it, because archaeology is really, 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 really complicated. And this is, I'm sorry to inflict this on you so early in the morning. This is an entity relation diagram. So it's basically a way of describing a data structure. And this is for a relational database that describes Anglo-Saxon graves and grave goods. And the author of this deposited this entity relation diagram with the data set that they provided for and archived in the Archaeology Data Service, which is really the world's premier data repository. And it's an absolute leader in this field. And John Hines here did a fantastic job documenting this data set. This is fantastic documentation and metadata, but it really illustrates the huge complexity of this one project. So this is just a single project. And if you imagine that there, say a dozen or 100 or 1,000 of these different projects, each with this level of complexity, then you can start imagining that data reuse becomes a huge challenge in archaeology, because there's a huge amount of complexity that we have to tame first in order to be able to make sense and use this kind of information. So if you are interested in Anglo-Saxon graves, this is going to be a great data set for you, but you might be needing to sort of understand this one data set in the context of, say, maybe a dozen or 24 other data sets, all with similar levels of complexity. And that's where you're going to have a huge challenge. And so one of the reasons that we focus all this effort on data curation up front and interoperability up front when we publish data with open context is that it really starts helping to some ways pay down that debt, right? So instead of leaving that for future users to sort through all by themselves, we try to do as much as we can to relate all of these various different kinds of data sources to a common framework so that they can work together, be explored as a larger aggregate whole, and have some interoperability, have some additional description, annotation with those linked data standards that I talked about. And in doing so, that hopefully makes the data that we publish a bit easier to use and a bit easier to even browse. So the real point of doing all of that curatorial work, again, is to try to tame some of that complexity. And just want to make a note when we do that too, is that we still retain project-defined attributes and relationships and descriptions with the data that we publish. So people have put a lot of work into, say, their typologies, into the descriptive systems that they build to describe, the pottery or small finds or whatever that they're trying to describe. They put a lot of work and thought into that, and we may want to maintain that, and we want to make sure that that is available as the way the researchers present that. we're just, what we do when we ingest all of these different data sets is we just put them into a common database framework so that they could be queried and worked with together as a larger whole. So it's a way of trying to retain the original voice, I guess, and descriptive systems of the researchers as they do their own projects, while providing a common platform for serving up all of those different data sets from different sources. So just to describe the kinds of data that we do publish with Open Context, there's lots of archaeological sites, so about 1 million archaeological sites from the Digital Index of North American Archaeology specifically. And then we also have many other kinds of data at various kinds of scales. So lots of zooarchaeology is also in Open Context, so animal bone specimens that are described by zooarchaeologists. We have growing numbers of records of paleobotany data sets. Lots of objects, so artifacts described from various projects from around the world, including donut stones in California, all sorts of historical materials at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, etc. And some of these different kinds of records are coming from archaeological surveys, and others are coming from excavations. And in some ways, the surveys and the excavations are both interesting because they deliver content at a very that's very diverse, right? So an excavation project, again, will have multidisciplinary teams, people who do the zooarchaeology, people who do the paleobotany, people who do various kinds of specialist studies on different classes of objects. And those data sets, together with the stratigraphic features and deposits, those are the types of things that we also publish. So you can see that there's a huge amount of variety in Open Context in terms of the kinds of content that we publish that touches on lots of different aspects of archaeology. And I'll just hopefully not kill everybody with a bunch of screenshots, but I just want to show you a little bit about what this all looks like. This is a coin from, it's actually from mainly from a Neolithic site, but there happened to be a late Roman coin hoard on top of that site. And the coin itself is published at this very granular unit. So it is a web page for a coin. And that coin has its own URL. It has its own citation, and sorry for the small size of the text, but I'm just trying to give you an overall sense about what this looks like. So it has a citation, it has a URL, it has an author, and the data that comes to us in Open Context to publish this coin actually came from lots of different sources. So there's a context database and that described the archaeological deposit where this coin came from. There was a photo catalog. There was an objects database, and then the coin specialist, the numismatist, actually had their own database. So there were multiple databases that provided records and context for this one coin. And when we published the data, we brought together and aggregated all of those different sources so that this object, this coin, could be referenced and seen with its photos and its containing archaeological context, its provenance. And that's one of the main points about Open Context, is that it's a way of trying to tame that complexity, right? So there's so much complexity in having multiple different databases, even on one project. So to find a record of a coin, if you just left all those databases and stuffed them into a repository, you'd have to download several different databases from one project and try to look up that coin. And that would be a harder thing to do. This provides this level of granular access to something that's very specific, and it's something that's very specific that's also archaeologically meaningful. It's an object that other people may want to cite and describe. And this is exactly what's happened, is that this specific coin, because it's been published in this very granular kind of a way, has been aggregated and republished and cited with people who are doing studies of late Roman coinage in Anatolia. And so this is an example also of something that's been cited more widely because of that level of specificity that we provide when we publish the data. It's not just objects that get that sort of level of specificity and that sort of treatment. This is an archaeological context. This is a unit from a late Roman Republican site in Italy, Gabi, and you can see that this one has a little bit of interesting geospatial data to it. It's got this sort of blobby polygon, but it also has associated with it linked descriptions and media. So this would have 3D models, images, but it also has relates to other archaeological units, other deposits through stratigraphic relationships. And again, having this common framework for publishing allows us to show objects, their contextual associations, and the contextual associations and stratigraphic relations of the deposits and the features where objects are coming from. So providing that kind of a framework helps to sort of realize a lot of what archaeology tries to do, which is tries to understand contextual relationships, and that's one of the main things that we try to make very, very clear and navigable with open context. Just to show that this also works globally, this is a description of a trench in Ecuador at site Buen Seco by Sarah Rao. And this is just a Neolithic site. So this is a Neolithic deposit at Kenan Tepe in Turkey. So lots of variety. All that variety so far, as I've shown, supported by a common infrastructure. And just to move forward a little bit about, it's not just a sort of being able to browse around these things, but because there's a common infrastructure for all of this, then we can start making things like querying and data analysis and visualization. That also becomes feasible. This is a search and display of textile-related objects at the site of Poggio Civitate, that Etruscan site in Italy that I mentioned earlier. And so these are individually plotted. So the spatial provenance of the objects is plotted, and as you can see it displayed on top of the plan view of the site, and this little spindle whorl that is shown that way. And you can see here there's an export function too. So in order to realize that whole notion of open data, the data that you find through that kind of a query, you can export as a CSV or as GIS and use other sorts of software. And then zooming up in somewhat bigger scales, very similar kind of a search. This is seeing more of an aggregate view of plant specimens at Giza, the Giza Plateau, Old Kingdom context. And this is zooming out even further. These are cattle tibia, so tibia bones of cattle. It's about 7,000 cattle tibia specimens that we've published for sites across Europe and Southwest Asia there. And that's, I think, about 24 projects actually represented in that one picture. And then also at a very continental scale, this is data from the Digital Index of North American Archaeology that I mentioned earlier. And these are actually data sets. This is a very small subset of those records in DINA that cross-reference and link with publications that came out of the Federal Register. So the Federal Register is the US government's method of notifying people about regulatory decisions. And this sort of highlights, in some ways, the sort of regulatory interests of US government in North American archaeological heritage. These are sites that are referenced in some sort of regulatory decision. Sometimes these are repatriation decisions. Sometimes these are permitting and other kinds of decisions that impact Native peoples across North America. And the ability to be able to query and explore data at these various different kinds of scales is something that is supported by this common infrastructure. I mentioned earlier too that the linking is a really fundamental aspect of this, and linking data is helps in two main ways for us. So one is about interoperability. So that picture that I showed earlier of the map of cattle tibia is made possible because we've linked up and annotated the various project-specific descriptions of cattle bones to some common standards, some common conceptual frameworks that are curated by experts in bioinformatics. So one is something called Uberon, which is the Uber ontology, and that is for anatomical elements. So things like, humerus and tibia, and the relationships of different bones to other parts of anatomy. And that is a nice cross-species standard that we use to be able to link together the bones that we publish to a common framework. And then GBIF is another standard that we use, and that's for biological taxa. And because we link data to these common frameworks, then we provide a layer of interoperability for those data so that they could be data from various sources can be searched and queried and analyzed together as a larger whole. That also is important, not just for interoperability, but also other aspects of context, in the sense that, say, the archaeological sites that we published with Dina, those sites are important for a variety of reasons and for a variety of communities, and are involved in politics and policy making. Those are the kinds of things that we can help surface by linking to data that is in other platforms and services. And so with the Digital Index of North American Archaeology, we've done a lot of work linking with the Federal Register, but also with TDAR. TDAR has records and reports and data sets associated for lots of these different sites, and also with academic publications, so with articles in JSTOR. So that helps starts to sort of show some of the contextual relationships between archaeological data that might be in one platform like Open Context and the sort of wider ecosystem of information that is part of the whole sort of discourse of in practice of archaeology. This gets, again, complicated and a lot because, again, archaeology is multidisciplinary. So these are just some of the vocabularies that, which are basically standards that we cite and reference when we publish data. And main point about this when we talk about linked data is that the notion of a web URI, a web address, is used to identify and reference concepts. Okay, so that is one of the sort of central things, and that allows us to really cite other people's data who are working on other platforms and other systems, and in doing so, that helps provide context to the data that we publish. And this is, citation is not just a sort of a form of interoperability, it's also a form of professional courtesy, and it's also a form of ethics, because it's who you cite, who you don't cite, there are implicit biases and decisions and all sorts of interesting issues to consider in that we need to be careful and be introspective about. And there needs to be a lot more guidance and thought about some of these things, especially when we consider that, say, when we work with, especially in the context of North American heritage, that this is heritage of living descendant communities who've gone through histories of colonialism. And that kind of, the sort of issues about linking and who to link to and how those linkings also offer a form of recognition, those are really interesting kinds of theoretical concerns that actually need a lot more exploration. And so here's just one example. This is a record in Open Context for the site of Chiwetzen. where and this record is associated with the Lower Elwha Klallam tribe, which is the Native American nation that is where that site is in their territory. So lots of thought needs to go into this, and there's and increasingly that some of that thought is going to help guide technological implementations also, and that's I think there's the project local context. I think is something that we're looking towards to see guidance on how to navigate some of these issues and how to work with these concerns with guidance for good practices. Now, as far as using all this stuff, data sets are great and all when you put them on the web, but it's really, what really matters is how people in the broader community actually make use of it and reuse the data that we publish. So this is just one example of a widely cited and project that published a lot of data with open context and for zooarchaeology. And the data sets that were published in this initial publication from 2014 have seen lots more reuse since then. So they've been explored and analyzed by other researchers for other publications since 2014. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we really want to see with open context is trying to make sure that the data enter into living conversations, living discussions through reuse. Other things that people have done is that they've built, worked with agent-based modeling using data from open context, built catalogs, used open context records for comparanda, and have studied the project itself for their own informatics research, and increasingly also using open context for teaching and for professional development. So those are important application areas. And just to highlight too is that the things that we do with open context have some strengths and have some weaknesses. So our general strategy is really, really good at exhibiting data in a web-friendly, accessible kind of a way so that data sets can be browsed and searched. And it's a common framework and it's generalized that allows that to happen for lots and lots and lots of different kinds of projects and lots of different kinds of contexts. And what's also really good about that is that makes those data that we publish really easy to cite in a very specific and granular kind of way. So you could point to a coin, you could point to a potsherd, you could point to a context and talk about that elsewhere. And that has a lot of advantages. But it's also hard to do. So it's expensive and it's labor intensive. It involves some technological challenges, and not all data should be necessarily that level of granularity is not helpful for all data sets. So those are the sort of strengths and weaknesses of open context. And so this is what I'm trying to get at here is that open context is really useful for certain application areas. It is not universally useful. So it's just one of a number of systems that needs to be in place to support archaeological research. And also thinking about this, I mentioned linked data a lot and how we use it so much to be able to help situate open context in a broader context of other data sets and other systems. It also helps frame thinking about how is it that what we do complements what other communities need and what other communities are doing. And our colleague Lee Lieberman, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships with our organization, she's helping us navigate some of those concerns, because those are actually really important kinds of concerns when we think about how we financially sustain open context for the longer term. And I think I will probably have talked for a long time. Sarah, do you want me to, what's our timing like? If we're going to do a QA or?
We have a Q&A and I've got like 9 already in myself. So leave time for Q&A, but we're a pretty flexible group. Some have to go at 10 for teaching, and that's all right. We also record, so Don't worry if people start
Okay.
going, your question
Okay.
will be answered. And we also like it, I think others know this, but if you could put questions in the chat, and that just helps me organize if there's any overlapping, and you'll most likely be called to ask your question, but it's nice to have them in the chat record. So questions, start flooding the chat with your questions, and then Eric, you can keep going how you like, or
Okay.
start taking some of my my freight of 9 questions there.
Okay. Well, I'll just highlight a couple two new projects and a few applications. So I'll skip ahead just a little bit so that we could get to those questions a little bit more. So one thing that I want to highlight too is that about how we sit within a broader landscape, and this is actually helps us think about how archaeology itself can work within a broader landscape of multiple scientific disciplines. And as I mentioned, one of the sort of main aspects about open context is that granularity, right? So you can point to very specific records. Each one of those records has a persistent ID, a persistent web page that you can reference and cite. And this turns out to be really important and useful for this project called iSamples. And iSamples is all about building persistent identifier services, metadata and discovery services for scientific specimens. So these are physical samples. And in our context in archaeology, a lot of that's going to be artifacts and ecofacts. And lots of granularity that we use to publish the data is actually really useful for being able to assign a persistent and specific ID to be able to reference something that, like say an object that might be studied for maybe neutron activation analysis, and then somebody else does some other sorts of study with it. Having a common identifier for that object would allow you to track different data sets and different publications that are used to describe that object. And that's one of the main goals about iSamples, is sort of building this sort of card catalog, if you will, of scientific specimens, so you can know where they're stored, you can know who's done what analyses on them, who's done what publications on them. So that notion of granularity is also something that's really important for this sort of wider interoperability, especially interoperability in different kinds of scientific domains. Another aspect of interoperability that I just want to highlight is that it's not all or nothing, and there are different kinds of interoperability for different kinds of audiences and for different kinds of uses. So open context is sort of like a layer cake of multiple kinds of ways that we make data sets that we publish available and reusable for different kinds of applications. So at the very bottom is kinds of standards that are just widely used throughout software, period. On the web, any generalized programming language could deal with JSON, which is just a structured data format that we publish. Going up that a little bit, there's more and more sort of levels of meaning and semantics built into these things. So GeoJSON is a way of expressing geospatial data. We support that. And at the very top are the very conceptually specific kinds of things where we link together, say, animal bones with Uberon and other ontologies to be able to provide very specific kinds of interoperability. So thinking about interoperability in various kinds of ways, it's not just an all or nothing kind of a thing, really facilitates sort of engagement with different kinds of communities, and some of those kinds of engagements lead to people to do their own things with the data that we publish. So these are two examples. This one is an augmented reality application where Stuart Eve basically used some of our cattle mapping data and other animal bone mapping data to project onto a three-dimensional interface that is thrown in front of him on his desktop, his table, which is kind of trippy and neat. And in this other application, a graduate student, Mohammed Abdul Hadi, under the supervision of Fatima Fard and Neha Gupta, worked on kind of graph visualizations, trying to figure out ways of exploring the data that we've published in open context to see if there are ways of visualizing if different decorative motifs are co-occurring on objects from an archaeological site. Again, this is Poggio Civitate as the data set that he was using. Dave Anderson and colleagues published this article in PLOS One about sea level rise. And these are data sets from all of these different SHPOs, site file data from American government, state governments, and putting these together and overlaying that and comparing it with models of climate change, wrote a paper that received a lot of press coverage about threats of sea level rise to archaeological heritage. And those data are still available in open context, and you can get them as this JSON data through our API to be able to pull those data out and be able to reuse that in other programming applications. And that has actually been done before by Jolene Smith, who used some of those data and made her own maps and overlay that with her projections of risks that she saw from coming from the Virginia state government to explore density of sites and the relationships with what might be impacted with Category 4 hurricanes hitting her state. So sadly, we don't have that many Jolene Smiths in archaeology, and we need more. And this is one of the sort of main new areas that we're moving into with open contexts, and that is really trying to bootstrap the community capacity to engage with these data. And two new postdocs, Megan Dennis and Paulina Pristopa, are working to promote data literacy. And hopefully we'll have many more Jolenes who be able to do interesting things with the data that we're publishing and that the data other people are publishing, and trying to do that also in thoughtful and ethically responsible kinds of ways. So those care principles again. So that's where I'm going to be closing. Basically, caring about context is super important when we're working with data and thinking about data. So it's I hope I was showing how, you know, open context is obviously my pet project, but it's only meaningful and only going to work if open context works within this larger landscape of other institutions and other communities. So really thinking outside of our own little silo is really important in actually doing all of this successfully. So thank you.